Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Humanities Cafe. My name is Stacy Chidowsha. I'm the program coordinator for the South Dakota Humanities Council. And this week, we're going to continue our conversations with featured authors for the upcoming Festival of Books. And I'm glad you could join us for this important and timely conversation because I'm so excited I can hardly stand it. Last week, we had the opportunity to speak with author Mary Annette Pember regarding Indian boarding schools and the generational trauma that resulted because of them, and a chilling part of our nation. That's for sure a chilling part of our nation's history, to be sure, but it's not the only thing we should be learning about. Today, we're going to talk about another of our nation's historical travesties and the ongoing journey to reconcile the past when we talk about slavery and the Civil War. So, the old adage that history is written by the victors suggests that those who win conflicts or power struggles are usually the ones who control the narrative, right? So, because they'll create a biased account or incomplete account of their perspective. So this is usually true, but not in the case of the Civil War. As today's guest works shows us, lies have multiple purposes, and one is to create power. The South used that power to change and even create a fictional history that many still believe today. And I'm delighted and honored to welcome to Humanities Cafe author and historian Ann Bausum to tell us about white lies, how the South lost the Civil War, then rewrote the history. And welcome. Please take a minute to tell us a little bit about yourself, what you study, what you write, and how you came to this expertise.
Well, thank you, Stacy, for that introduction and greeting. And I'm pleased to see so many other people have joined us. And I'm looking forward to the dialogue that will develop over this next hour. So, so I came to this project because of my background, and
can everybody mute your microphones, please? I'm getting some feedback here.
Okay, we ready?
Thank you. Yeah, there we go.
Okay, all right. I came to this project because of my background. As a Southerner, someone raised in the South. I've lived in Wisconsin almost my entire adult life. I also lived in New York City for a while. But I've been writing books primarily for children and teens for the past 25 years. And primarily I've written about social justice history. Almost all of the books are nonfiction history. And this book is kind of the culmination of, 2 or 3 decades of studying American history and making discoveries along the way that have compounded to result in this book.
Well, and I told Ann I've read this book now twice. It came out 2 days ago, by the way. Congratulations, Ann, because I took a look this morning. There are so many fabulous reviews. When you like Kirkus, Publishers Weekly, all starred reviews. So if you're a book nerd like some of us, you really can't get much better praise than that. I mean, it's an amazing book. So I have a lot of questions, and if you have questions, by all means, everybody, raise your hand, put a question in the chat. It is an interactive program, so we do want you to participate with us. So to start off, Ann, and the book, like I said, is amazing. The title is enticing. Tell us, what is it? The title is White Lies, How the South Lost the Civil War, then Rewrote the History. So tell us about the title. How did you decide on the title, and what inspired you to write this book?
So the title is one of the first things, the original parts of the book. And that's not always the case. Often publishers will make suggestions or even substitute entirely different titles, but we all knew from the beginning that was the right title for this book. It does that title magic of having multiple meanings, because we have an association of what a white lie is. But then this book is about a different kind of white lie, because the lies are racially motivated and sprang from within the elite white Southern community before, during, and after the Civil War. So it seemed like the perfect way to encapsulate some intrigue and reality with the title, and then the subtitle helps to clarify the contradiction, as Stacy was saying, with the victors usually writing the story of a war, and the fact that in this case the narrative really was claimed by the South, and to the point where now it's so integrated into American society that we wouldn't even recognize its origins.
Well, and you alluded to the other books that you write, and I actually printed out a page from your website. I'll put a link to the website um, in the chat. You write about important social, cultural, and historical. I have a lot of these, so I should have brought them. I have a stack of them on my desk at home. But you write in a way that's unbiased, it's accurate, well researched, it's comprehensive. How do you choose what to write about? What piques your interest, and what makes you think, "Oh, I need to write a book about that"?
Mhm. It's a great question. So I'm very lucky that I get to pick my topics. There are authors who write to the requests of the publishers. I'm lucky enough to be able to bring ideas to various publishing houses and say, I'd like to write about this. And invariably, they have some sort of a personal connection to me. And that's really important because I like to say that um, taking up the task of writing a book is like going on a really long date. And you want to be in love with this topic and what you're writing about, or it's miserable. And so when I can bring a personal connection, and maybe it's a book like this one, which is honestly just interwoven with my own background and the background of my ancestors, um, that helps to motivate you through the rough places, and carry you to the finish line. And most of my books have a social justice theme to them, and that's not an accident. I grew up during the 1960s and the 1970s, and that was my world. That was the baseline of what I thought, how I interacted with current events and the world. And so it's not surprising that I've chosen to look back at those decades or that theme of social justice and injustice as I've continued to turn it into a career.
Yeah, I was because some of the ones that I have of the books I have, you've written about Stonewall, you've written about the AIDS crisis, the March Against Fear, Marching to the Mountaintop, Freedom Riders. Denied, Detained, and Deported is very timely for right now, although
Mhm.
this was published quite a few years ago. But how has the writing of these previous works directed the path on the writing of this one? Because this one's much thicker than the other books. Of course, it has a
Yeah,
lot of information, so it needs to be.
yeah,
But
I
how did
kind of,
that direct your path?
sure, good question. I kind of surprised myself because I did not expect to be writing a book that was this thick. I mean, it's a bit
Hmm.
daunting, and
Yeah.
um, it was to write it. Um, and so I would say it was a good thing that I had 18 books under my belt by then. I had written a variety of styles of books, lengths of books for different age groups, and it took some time to figure out how to um, create a book that would be this long, but also be engaging. Because one of my goals has always been to write books for young people that read like a novel. They don't want to put them
Mm.
down. I think that's really important, especially now more than ever. We're competing against so many different um, distractions that it's very hard to bring books back to front and center. And so it's very important for the narrative to be compelling. And fortunately, I had an incredibly compelling narrative because of the facts that are involved. And like many of my books, um, it has information that's not just informative to young people, it's informative to all of us. I've had so many people who've looked at it, and from the editorial team on beyond, they're like, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. Oh my God. And so there's definitely it should be an appeal for adult readers as well. All teens and adults would benefit from familiarizing themselves with this material.
I couldn't agree more. I think, and Ann and I were speaking briefly before we went live here, and as I told her, I myself, I spent a significant amount of time in higher education. I, went through 2 master's degree programs, and I consider myself pretty well versed on all things education and history, but I was disturbed at how much I didn't know after reading this book. I felt robbed that I
Mhm.
wasn't, brought up to speed on all this stuff as a young person. But you have done extensive research for this book and paid exquisite attention to detail. So where and how do you find most of your sources? And were there any particular rabbit holes? Because I mean, I didn't know who Jubal Early was, George Junkin, Hillary Herbert, all these characters, and you have such a good narrative, like you follow along in over time their path in this journey, and they're people that most of us have never heard of. So how did you find your sources? How did you decide which to pick and put in the book? And it's just yeah. How did you do that?
It took a long time. This was I spent 5 years on this book. That's about twice as long as any other project I've done. And my starting place is always historians who have taken, a slice of what I want to write about and spent 10 years researching and writing about it. And bringing facts together in a way that I just don't have the ability to do as an independent author. I would never have finished this book if I hadn't had this space of these shoulders to stand on, this base of scholarship from the past 30 years or so, which has been remarkable in pulling out details. For example, there's a historian that I cite in the book who spent surely years combing through the records in North Carolina to try to understand why pensions were awarded to various constituencies of individuals in the teens and 20s, and came to conclusions that made it clear that this was not an act of generosity. It was an act of it was a strategic move to try to build solidarity as the white ruling class in the South was institutionalizing the Jim Crow era. And I wouldn't have known about that without the scholarship of that historian. And there's so many instances like that. And so along the way, I met people who I'd never heard of either. And I'm not sure that these aren't household names. These aren't people you would necessarily know about, but they ended up being very critical they were very important at very critical times. And I came to realize that they were actually, it was like the book became a relay race, and we were passing torches from one era to the next through this continuity of deception or counteraction to the deception and so forth. And it was a way to span really almost the entire history of the United States without it turning into a textbook.
But it should be a textbook. It's so good. So let's dig in and unpack. Okay, what is the lost cause, and what's that narrative, and how did it come about? Who created that? How did they develop it? What's the lost cause?
So I like to say the Lost Cause is the most successful propaganda campaign in the United States that you've never heard of. It's well known to historians. I've begun to see it referenced in the media in various stories, but I suspect most of us haven't encountered that phrase in our everyday life. But it is and was a very deliberate construct that began to emerge after the Civil War in the South. And let's just picture what the state of things was in 1865 in the South. The South had basically been destroyed. The infrastructure had been, you know, overrun and taken apart. So many homes had been devastated by the loss of breadwinning members of the families. Um, and this had all been done in an effort to create a rebel nation, the Confederate States of America, with a central founding principle of being able to perpetuate slavery. And slavery, this is one of the many things we learn in the book, is that slavery was not something that was common among white people in the South. There were many, many white people living in the South who were not enslavers. The people who were enslavers were the elite upper class, and if they enslaved anybody, they usually enslaved a lot of people. So they had helped to create this breakaway nation, and they were at risk of being blamed at the end of the Civil War for basically destroying the South. And so it became very clear very quickly that it was important to spin the narrative, as we would say now. And there had already been a century or more of self-deception and deception of others going on about the nature of slavery, about the kindness of enslavers toward the people they enslaved, and so forth. But that narrative was deepened and reinforced to make it clear that slavery hadn't been bad according to this narrative, and that the soldiers who had fought had done something noble. The nature of what had prompted the cause of the war was altered from slavery to this notion that they were fighting for states' rights that they claimed had been placed in the Constitution, which in fact the Supreme Court had said did not guarantee the right to secede, did not guarantee the right to ignore federal laws. But nonetheless, they began to, they were masters at manipulating the language and therefore our understanding of events. And the marvel of the lost cause was that it could be amended and added to over time. And it's not like someone sat around in a library like, okay, these are the principles of the lost cause. It was just in the ether. It was just lies that were repeated so consistently, generation after generation, until they became accepted as fact. And we can understand how that can happen.
Mm. Well, in the book, there's a list of 20 white lies. And so I picked out three that I really stuck with me because this is what I learned. These lies were what I thought to be true growing up in learning the history. So the first one to unpack is the Civil War wasn't fought over slavery. It was all about states' rights.
Yeah, so I've kind of previewed that a little bit. And this notion that that this wasn't a rebellion. And I think this is a good place to teach people what I didn't know, and you may not know, which is the official name for what we call the Civil War was the War of the Rebellion. That was what the government called it. That's what Congress called it. That's how it's listed in the congressional record. That's how it's listed on all the the post-war histories that were collected to try to make sense of what had happened. And I sort of jumping into other lies here, but this idea that it had been a rebellion and that the South had rebelled for the cause of slavery was something that that white ruling class wanted to distance itself from after the war, which is where this idea came from that, oh, they weren't actually rebelling. They were defending the Constitution. That's why the South went to war against the northern states or the United States of America.
And then the second one I wanted to talk about was the American Civil War was a war between the states. And that kind of alludes to what you were just talking about the name. I mean,
Right.
it seemed pretty common, but it's a very clear misnomer.
Well, it's got that little trick that lies have
Mhm,
where it's not exactly untrue. There were
mhm.
states or former states that fought other states. So why couldn't you call it a war between the states? But this was a this name was imposed on the history very deliberately in an effort to cover up that and divert attention from that original purpose of the war, which was to rebel in order to defend slavery. This name, the War of the Rebellion, became increasingly offensive to the white ruling class as it began to regain control over state governments as whites began to be elected again to serve in the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, and and the push was made to officially rename the war, or at least to stop using that War of the Rebellion. And that's where the Civil War term starts to come in. And that becomes sort of the standard of what we're going to call that conflict that took place between 1861 and 1865. And so the War of the Rebellion is pretty much forgotten. Again, historians know it. You can find it on markers, but it's not in the history books the way it would have originally been. And so, where does the war between the states come from? It comes from this organization that um, is, again, it's another sort of quiet part of America that I hadn't really paid much attention to, but it turned out to be incredibly influential, especially at the turn of the last century. The organization is the United Daughters of the Confederacy. This was an organization made up of women whose ancestors had been tied to the Confederacy, either as soldiers or as, willing female assistants who were working in creating supplies, goods, medical care, and so forth. United Daughters of the Confederacy, founded in 1894. And this organization had multiple aims, but one of the things that they did was to try to promote a South-friendly version of history. And that included the promoting this idea of using the title "The War Between the States." And so let's just think about, why would they have wanted that? Why did they care about that so much? If you think about what the War of the Rebellion means, it clearly defines the nature of the conflict, that there was a rebellion, right? And we went to war because one side had rebelled against the other. The Civil War neutralizes that, but when you call it the war between the states, it it equalizes it even more, because it's as if they're two equal parties. This group of states, that group of states. The blame is gone for, you can then start to call it also the War of Northern Aggression, as was done, and to suggest that the South was the victim, that the war between the states wasn't something they had asked for, but it was something that was imposed on them by this other group of states. And when I'm referring to the South or Southerners, I'm referring to these historical figures from the turn of the last century, or decades shortly before or after. Just to make it clear, we're talking historically here about regions of the country.
Well, and I think it's interesting too that, and you mentioned this in your book, that the war between the states, that title is still in textbooks. It's on the U.S. citizenship test,
Right.
and in 1995 it was on a postage stamp. So it's still that it's floating around out there. So the third one lie that is most like interesting to me is that the Confederate battle flag is a symbol of Southern honor.
Yeah, no, this is an important one. And
Mhm.
one of the reasons this book seemed so important to write for teenagers is because this is confusing, right? We're all confused about this because these are topics that we're talking about right now. What's the nature of the Confederate commemoration? Um, what what is the power of this Confederate battle flag? Um, is it appropriate to try to restrict um, commemorations like that, or artifacts from the Civil War? What opinion should we have of them? So the history of the Confederate battle flag, that's what it's called. It actually, and we all know what I'm talking about. It's the rectangle with the stripes, the red banner, um, that is associated with the Confederacy, um, in various ways. Um, so that flag actually never was followed into battle. It was not a battle flag during the Civil War. It was not the battle. It was not the flag of the Confederacy. It's um, a rectangular representation of a square flag that was used by one segment of the Confederate Army under Robert E. Lee in Virginia. And and so to call it the Confederate battle flag is to mislead people on its significance. The flag, this rectangular version of that old battle flag, became popularized during that same period that the United Daughters of the Confederacy were coming to power in 1894. And this is, Reconstruction ends in, Civil War ends in 1865. Reconstruction ends for all intents and purposes in 1877. And then there's this period of transition as the white elite slowly regains power in the South and imposes Jim Crow. And by the end of the 19th century, their grip on power is becoming strong enough so that they're beginning to be able to phase out voting rights for African Americans, office holding by Black people, etc. And and this battle flag becomes kind of a symbol of the resurgence of white rule in the South. It starts to go onto state flags. It becomes associated with this resurgent white rule, and it's not a symbol that makes a lot of appearances for a while, and beyond these sort of static representations on state flags and so forth, like in Mississippi, until the civil rights movement kicks into high gear in the 1960s, and you began to see protests and counter protests about civil rights in the South, and that Confederate flag, it makes a huge comeback. And it's not fair to say it wasn't there at all. It was being waved at football games. You had teams that were called the Rebels that would wave that flag. The school where my dad taught when I was growing up in Virginia, Virginia Military Institute, they would wave that flag at football games in the early and mid 1960s. So and it was not really associated with being a white supremacy symbol, but it was being used as one. And then we began to see it continue to pop up at moments when there's a push for white supremacy, such as when Dylan Roof was photographed holding a gun and that flag in a photograph that came to light shortly after his attack at the Black church in Charleston, South Carolina, where I think it was 13 people were murdered. So people began to realize that this flag actually held associations for some people, in any case, if not all of us, as a symbol of white power. And that is why it's not fair to just claim it's a symbol of heritage. It's way more coded than that.
Yeah, one of the things that I've heard before is the Confederate flag is to Black people what the swastika is to Jews, and
Hmm.
that really makes it hit home. And
Yeah,
I remember growing up watching the Dukes of Hazzard. It was my favorite show when I was a kid, and Dixie was the orange car with the big Confederate flag on the side. I had no idea what it was,
right.
that it was actually a symbol of oppression. So how is it, and in that vein, then how difficult is it to reteach a corrected history of the United States? Like now, I know now, many years later, that Confederate flag was not necessarily a good thing. So, how difficult though is it to reteach an entire population of people that hey, you were lied to?
Well, I'm a historian. I'm not an educator. So I'm making my contribution by writing this book. But I think one of the ways a nation gains wisdom is by the evolution of our current events. Certainly, the civil rights movement created an awareness among many people in the population that that wrongs had been committed and that they needed to be corrected. And in recent years, there have been multiple instances where we've had moments of civic, um, awareness, consciousness raising, whether it's that massacre in South Carolina or the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017, or the reaction to the murder of George Floyd in 2020. And and we've learned more about Confederate monuments and the fact that they may also be symbols and really are also, as the book clearly documents, symbols they were emblems designed to promote white supremacy. We have the ability to learn, but I think it's instructive to notice how aggressively efforts are being made to stop the spreading of that information in schools, in libraries, through book bannings, through restrictions on curriculum content, and so forth, because there continues to be a power structure that benefits from the sorts of messages and oppression that are represented through these lies.
I wanted to take a minute here, just to take a brief pause, see if anybody has any questions. You could raise your hand throughout any of this. You could do that. Raise your hand, put a question in the chat. Does anybody want to ask Ann a question or contribute to the conversation? Okay.
I'll pop in if you want, Stacy.
Sure, go ahead.
Hi, Anne. It's so good to see you.
You too, Jennifer.
Yes. And I would say that even though, yes, you are a historian first, I believe that you're also an excellent educator as a byproduct of that. I wondered partly this is all because this is contentious, and I know you to be a very fair-minded person who's going to go where the facts take you. But we're in such a difficult, political time right now with such strong feelings, and that makes your book all the more timely because of, the issues with monuments and things like that. Did it cause you some second guessing or some how exactly should I word this, or what is the best way to convey this in the moment that we're living in?
Great
Well, that's a
question.
very perceptive question because I did not write this book in a vacuum. And I understood that not everybody was going to embrace it, and that some people might actively oppose the kinds of things that I unearthed and have knitted together in a way that young people, I think, can follow and understand, and adults can as well. Did it make me pause? Did it make me change? Well, no. Did I think about it a lot? I sure did. I took a lot of walks while I was working on this book, and that would be on my mind. And I would say, um, you know, I am not a timid person when it comes to standing my ground. And I decided I was all in on this one. And partly that's because this book goes back really deep for me. I've got my textbook sitting right here that I was given when I was a student in fourth grade and in seventh grade. That, if we opened up just about any page, we would start to find these lies. And I was an adult before I realized the extent to which I'd been lied to.
That's enough. I really love you.
Well, can somebody mute their microphone, please?
And I think what really empowered me was in 2017, I was at a library convention in Atlanta, and I was talking about my book, The March Against Fear, which was history from 1966 in Mississippi. And I had recently gotten my hands on these old textbooks. It's not like my parents had them in their basement. I had a classmate that I've stayed in touch with from childhood who was able to track them down for me. She knew what the books were and she was able to get them for me. And I had begun to read them and I was aghast. I think the only time I've read a book that literally made me sick to my stomach. And so I showed the covers of the books in a presentation that I gave in Atlanta. And a woman came up to me afterward and said, "Oh, I taught that fourth grade book." And I said to her, I asked her, because I hadn't begun to piece all this together, I asked her, well, what did that feel like to teach that history as a Black woman to your students? And she looked so puzzled that I would ask that question. And finally she said, well, we thought it was all true. And that was really the lightning bolt that told me I had to understand this. I had to understand how had we managed. I just assumed my teachers had unwillingly taught this because my teacher in fourth grade was also an African American, and I had felt sorry for her that she had had to teach this to me, and and perhaps she was in the same situation as this other educator that I'd met, where the population had been convinced that these lies were true. So why did I persevere without pulling any punches? Because I had felt personally wronged and damaged. And it's not like this is a vendetta. This is just, you know, nothing upsets me more than being misled. And to know that that's being done to children is is unforgivable. And so if I can help to right that wrong, if I can help to correct that for a new generation, if I think how do we change the nation's understanding, one person at a time, one person at a time, spreading that word, just the way those lies were spread. Okay. And so, I mean, did I pull any punches? No, we were still revising the book into, I think, March to reflect content that was shifting with the new administration.
I'm glad you brought that up, Ann, because in your book, everything that you just said, I was thinking about something in your book, and I actually looked it up, so I'm going to read it to you. It says, it's a quote, I believe, from U.S. Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, and she says, "A nation divided by race and racism, by political powers, and by statues can seem to be at war with itself once again. We cannot forget because the uncomfortable lessons are often the ones that teach us the most about ourselves. We cannot forget because we cannot learn from past mistakes we do not know exist." So in the current administration, which you're talking about, it's criticized educational that it views as radical indoctrination, and is emphasized. I wrote this down: an education viewed as, quote, accurate, honest, unifying, inspiring, and ennobling presentation of American history. But from whose point of view will these classifications be made? Because when you think about the un-American piece, within these restrictions, how then do we teach an accurate historical account of American history that's taught that's fraught with conflict and injustice? So, like, how accurate and honest can we really be, and not fall within the parameters of being considered un-American by President Trump's definition? So, because like last week, what I mentioned, we spoke with Marionette Pember and the issue of American Indian boarding schools and generational trauma on Native Americans. And Ann and I were speaking about this before we came on too. I think most people don't understand that the proliferation of slavery and the mistreatment of the Native peoples actually is what caused the South to proliferate slavery. Because as some wealthy Southern plantation owners bought up the land that the natives were forced off of, that it just made slavery worse. So all of these things are linked. And how do you teach a history without teaching the real history?
You're not teaching history. You've created propaganda. And
Right.
that's basically what I was raised on. And it's convenient to the ruling class to have people anesthetized to in this heritage, to have them ignorant of this heritage, because it makes it easier to manipulate people, um, and and create policies moving forward that are advantageous to the ruling class. So, I spend a lot of time talking in the book about the manipulation of language And I think that definition that you read, or that instruction you read, is a brilliant example, because you can't do what that just asked. You can't teach a quote true history, or whatever the wording was, and have it be quote accurate, and have it be ennobling, or whatever the words were. I'm paraphrasing here, but
Yeah.
it's then you're not teaching history. It's propaganda. Um, how do we push back against that? It's very difficult, but um, I think, again, spreading the word, being well informed ourselves, making connections with members of Congress who may not want to be hearing this sort of information, but if they keep a tally of all these calls, all these letters, and if they're getting feedback that says it's actually not my preference for the Smithsonian to be rewritten to match this ideal version of a hunky-dory history. Um, that's your power. That's something that we as citizens can do. And
Well, and
that's
I
one of the
just,
latest things that's come out. I don't know if people have heard that yet. This directive, I think the Smithsonian has 120 days to analyze exhibits in about a dozen of its museums and tune them up.
well, even I was thinking about it because when I think about my pre-law classes back in college, and this is a long time ago, but like when I think about even at the college level, we learned about, Supreme Court cases are how they precedent, the issue of precedent is how they're supposed to decide cases. So if you're talking about, just as an example, we're talking about Black Hills history. So why is it such a big deal? Okay, so in 1980, the Supreme Court said that land was stolen from the Lakota people. In the case, I think, U.S. v. Sioux Nation of Indians. And then the question comes up like, well, what do you mean it was stolen from the Lakota people? Well, it was given to them, through the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. And so history comes into it. And how do you teach that
Yeah.
real things even now? I mean, I don't know how they're supposed to do that. And I think Dell has an excellent question in the chat. So he asked, who is to decide what is taught? And I think that's the big question, right?
Yeah, no, that cuts to the chase, doesn't it? It's funnily enough, we actually have a structure that does this. I imagine your state, like my state, Wisconsin, has professional educators and standards that are set with between the collaboration of educators, specialists, parents, etc. Um, that's the way you can help to influence what is taught in your state by whatever those standards are that are then um, held to account in the classroom. But beyond that, um, I remember the days, and you don't have to go back to the earliest days, but when my kids were in school, for example, educators had a lot of independence, and they had the ability to make judgment calls about what they wanted to impart to their students. And I think that's valuable, because these are the people who are as well informed as anyone in the school district. They know the students better than anyone in the district. And so I think empowering our educators and our administrators, instead of intimidating them and making them afraid that they're going to be lose their jobs, or that, if they bring a certain book into the classroom, they're going to be punished. It would be useful to get back to that mindset, keeping in mind that the forces behind the effort to muzzle people, it's a pretty small group. It's a small but vocal group. It's not unlike the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which just had the determination and the wealth and the manpower to have an outsized influence on society. And it is possible um, for that level of resources to be marshaled for good rather than for corrupting our what we teach in the classrooms.
And so with the lost cause, excuse me, narrative, is it still going strong, especially in the South? I mean, because I know I did not know, and I learned this in your book. Thank you for writing this book, Ann. I can't thank you enough. But I did not know that at the Disney theme parks, the Song of the South, and the Splash Mountain ride were all named after the Uncle Remus stories,
Right.
of slaves. And so they were whitewashed into this cute little narrative, and when we get Splash Mountain, and in 2009 they changed that to the Princess and the Frog ride. So
I think it was
looks like
2019 actually.
2019,
It's very,
yeah, sorry,
yeah, very
2000.
recent. Yeah.
So it looks like there's some movement, but like you mentioned the Dylan Roof's massacre at the Ebenezer Church in 2015, and then the Unite the Right rally 2017, George Floyd in 2020. How do those help to shed light on the false narrative of the lost cause? And then what impact did the death of George Floyd have in light of changes in regards to the removal of Confederate statues? Because I think I don't know if I saw it in your book, but I saw it somewhere that monuments and such are basically just the same thing as a whites only sign.
Right. That's it. That's a quote in the book from a historian. Um, and I started this book. I had a lot of unanswered questions. I did not know all of these lies were lies when I started the book. I write in the back of the book that this book was it was a healing process for me to kind of wash away these misunderstandings that had been, had seeped into my brain, and to better understand um, what these statues meant, what that flag meant, and how they came to have so much power. And so when I started the book, I didn't have an opinion about the Confederate monuments. I grew up in Lexington, Virginia. It was stuffed full of those kinds of monuments. But by the end of the book, I have no doubt whatsoever, but that those are dangerous tools of white supremacy, and they have no business in our public spaces. If people want to move them to private museums or to public museums where they're contextualized, or to cemeteries or something like that, then that's a different matter. But they do not belong in the public square. And I'm probably losing my train of thought because I feel pretty strongly about the statues thing. And I'm concerned that as many statues as were removed during the periods that followed, particularly the 2017 events in Charlottesville, that was definitely a catalyst for removing statues. And then after George Floyd's murder, quite a few more came down. Many of them are in storage. I don't know if you followed the news that there's one that was taken down in Washington, D.C. that's going back up, that wasn't specifically honoring a Confederate, but it did honor somebody who was tied to the Confederacy and other aspects of white supremacy. So, those are the sorts of things that should draw comment as well. The renaming of all these Army bases. I don't know if people followed that an entire the House and Senate overrode a veto of President Trump in his first term, ordering the military to remove all Confederate names from all U.S. Defense Department assets. And 9, I believe, military bases were renamed, and they've all now just been renamed back using this cheater code of finding other soldiers who had the same last names as Braxton Bragg, for example, and so it's Fort Bragg again. Those are the sorts of things that there's actually some movement in Congress to push back against that. That's the kind of thing that could be raised with a senator or congressman are women as well.
Edie, you had your hand up. Did you have a question?
Well, and thank you for writing this book. And also, I just like, I appreciate that you mentioned, you had to think about a lot on these walks and kind of do some deeper reflection on what you were writing. I've heard that history doesn't repeat itself. I've also heard that history does repeat itself. Lately, I heard history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And I wonder in those reflective moments where you were noticing that history is kind of rhyming, like it's similar, but it's different.
Yeah, I think it's rhyming pretty well right
Yeah.
now.
Mhm.
And I think we're wise to be attentive to that. I think everybody has to find their own bandwidth for where you want to engage, how you want to engage, and how you want to use your voice beyond that. But just being informed and thinking is so important, and helping to connect people. I mean, this is a group that you're all book lovers, and helping to connect people to this book or other books that deal with those stories that are so easy to sweep under the carpet. And your state and my state, the upper Midwest, with our Native American stories, um, this this we need to be pushing this content forward, um and recognizing it in a way that allows us, I like to use the analogy of a family, because we've all had families, we've all had conflicts in our families, and the families that are able to talk about those openly are able to then heal and maybe take their interfamily relationships to a higher level. And I think a nation that can do that really has a tremendous potential. This is a remarkable country. It's unique in its founding. Um, so many mistakes were made along the way. And and I go to out of my way to emphasize this in the book. I am really glad that that this is my country, and I am proud of the things that we've done that are commendable, and very aware of the fact that often we fall short. And the only way to do better is to learn. And so, if history starts to repeat itself, then or to rhyme, then by understanding, by seeing that, and not just blindly following along, we are already contributing to trying to get to that higher level.
There's another question in the chat, and we're going to run short on time, which is unfortunate. Like I'd like to tack on another hour, but KE wants to know, as a researcher, are you concerned about access to archives, etc., being limited or totally cut off? Excellent question.
It is an excellent question. Yeah. Well, so many archives are not in U.S. government hands. So many of them are in university hands or private collections and so forth. I'm less concerned about those. I think there are a lot of guardrails and layers that would have to be penetrated for that to be silenced. So much material is online. So many people are documenting what's online, so that even if it comes down from online, you can still find it. I think that's something we should be comforted by. I am concerned about accessing federal documents, but especially just statistics and so forth. We run the risk that the continuity of our understanding of education statistics or labor statistics or whatever is going to be lost, and then that makes it harder to analyze the impacts of policies and so forth on us in real time. It's a concern. I think that's a valid question. I may not have given as much thought as I should have. I was out east working on a new project, and did go to the Library of Congress. I was like the old days. but it was also April. And I don't know, within a few weeks, the Librarian of Congress had been fired. So I just don't know. I did some work at a private library, and that was as normal as ever. So we have to hope, and that this material is saved, that there are people quietly making sure files are backed up or whatever, if there is any concern.
And I wanted to kind of end the whole thing today with the quote that it just jumped out at me from the introduction of your book. And it says, "It's not surprising today, during an era where issues of race, class, and privilege are such a focus of national debate, that the matter of truth is too.
Mhm.
Lies swirl around us, corrupting our understanding of current events in the same ways that they have distorted our appreciation of the past. Until we break this cycle, until accuracy replaces misinformation, we will struggle. As long as people in power can use lies to sow divisions, we will be held back. But when we reject the lies and embrace the facts of our national story, both its moments of shame and those of majesty, we create the potential to flourish." And I think that is a profound statement, because the truth is a tremendous task, but a necessary one, perhaps now more than ever. So from that frame of reference, then, what do you most hope readers will take away from the book, White Lies?
Oh, thank you. And thank you for creating this opportunity to visit. And I'll hope to meet some of you when I'm in South Dakota next month for the festival. Um, I hope readers have a deeper understanding of how lies don't just spring from nowhere. Lies have a purpose, and understanding the backstory behind a lie is the first way to fight against it. And I like to focus on contrasting lies with facts, because the word truth can be very manipulated. And I think, that presidential order you read from, I think that's the one that's labeled "Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History" or something like that. Truth is a squishy word. Facts are facts, and there are no alternate facts. There can be lies, but if we as readers can be discerning, and that's harder than ever, I tell you, but we know how to find books. We know how to talk to informed citizens and professionals, and if we think something sounds fishy, look into it, because it may well be. And that way, the readers of the book can perhaps know to be on their guard, and be better educated, which, if I understand things, is what we're trying to do with our schools. And so let's do that.
I encourage all of you, if you have the opportunity to get your hands on this book, White Lies: How the South Lost the Civil War That Rewrote the History. Highly recommend it. And I can't thank you enough for being here with us today. I hope you'll all be able to join us. We are out of time, so I do want to invite you back to see us next week. We're going to be talking with Hannah Haxgard. She's an attorney and a professor at the University of South Dakota, and she's going to talk to us about rural law practice and how that's working out in South Dakota, things that are happening there. In the meantime, again, thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Ann. Again, tremendous book, absolutely love it. And thanks for all of you for joining us. I hope to see you next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ann.
Yeah, you all are the best. See you soon.